7 cents was not a price. It was an insult with coins attached, and every man standing at the forks of the road that July morning knew it. The crossroads sat a mile east of Natchez, where the Liberty Road crossed the Washington Road, and in the summer of 1849 the heat there had weight to it. It pressed down on the whitewashed pens like a hand on the back of a neck. The dust was the color of bone. Buzzards rode the hot air in slow rings above the pen roofs, patient as clerks. Along the fence line the traders had set out their tables, and behind the tables stood the people they meant to sell, dressed in the cheap jean cloth the trade favored, their faces oiled, their hair cut, their scars powdered over with lamp-blackened grease so that a buyer might not see what a whip had written on them. If stories like this one matter to you, take a second right now to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It costs you nothing, and it helps these histories reach the people who need to hear them. Now, back to the crossroads. July was the wrong month for a sale. The good season ran from the cotton harvest through the spring, when planters had money in hand and the fever had gone out of the river towns. In July, the buyers were thin and the traders were nervous, and what stood at the forks of the road in July was what had not sold in November. The trade had a word for it. They called it refuse. Men with hernias, women with a cough that would not clear, a boy with a clubbed foot, an old man whose eyes had gone milk-white. They were run through fast, in a lot, at whatever the auctioneer could get, so the trader would not have to feed them through another season. Ruel Kettleman's refuse lot was 7 that morning, and the last of the 7 was the largest man anyone at that crossroads had ever seen. He stood 6'8" if he stood an inch. His shoulders filled the frame of the pen door so completely that he had to turn sideways to come through it, and when he stepped up onto the block, the boards took his weight with a groan that made 2 men in the front laugh out loud. His head was shaved. Along the left side of his jaw, the bone had been broken once and had knitted back crooked, so that the whole lower half of his face sat a half-inch out of true, and it gave him a look of permanent patient contempt. 2 fingers were gone from his left hand. On the meat of his right shoulder, somebody had burned a letter into him, a K, deep and old and shiny. Kettleman climbed up beside him and put a hand on his arm, the way a man puts a hand on a plow he is tired of owning. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have all heard about this one, so I will not stand here and lie to you in the sun. This is Goliath, 6'8", 22 years of age, sound in the wind. He will carry 400 pound of anything you name from here to the river landing without setting it down." He paused. "He does not speak, not to me, not to any man, not for 3 years. He has been whipped for it, and he has been starved for it, and he has been offered money for it, and he has not opened his mouth. He has killed no one that I can prove. He has put 3 overseers on their backs that I can. I have had 11 years of him, and I have not had $11 of good out of him, and I am selling him because I'm done, and I will take what the crowd gives." He turned and spat over the edge of the block. "Somebody give me $200 for the biggest man in Adams County." Nobody spoke. The buzzards turned. A mule down the fence line shifted and blew. 100. A man near the back laughed. "I'll give you a rope for him, Ruel. 50. $50 and he'll clear 10 acres of canebrake before Christmas." Nothing. And then, from under the pecan tree where the shade was, a woman's voice said, 7 cents. The crowd came around like a herd turning. She was standing alone, which was the first strange thing, because women came to the forks of the road often enough, but they came with a husband or a factor or a son. She was past 50. Her morning dress had been good black bombazine once and had gone rusty at the seams. She wore gloves in that heat. Her face was long and dry and gave away nothing at all. Kettleman knew her. Half the men there knew her. "Ms. Renfrew," he said slowly, "did I hear you say 7 cents?" "You did." Somebody whooped. Somebody else said loud, "Widow's got a bargain eye." And the laughter went up and rolled along the fence, and the people standing behind the tables did not laugh because they never did, and one young woman in the line closed her eyes. Kettleman stood a moment with his thumbs in his waistband. He was a man who had made a great deal of money by knowing exactly how much humiliation a thing was worth, and he did the arithmetic in front of everybody. He could hold Goliath another season and feed him. He could take $50 from nobody, because nobody was offering $50. Or he could sell the biggest man in the county for the price of a plug of tobacco in front of 40 witnesses to a broke widow in a dead woman's dress. And the story of it would go around Natchez for a year, and every time it was told, it would be told as a joke about her and not about him. He decided fast. "Sold," Kettleman said, "to the widow Renfrew of Tallow Creek, 7 cents. She came forward through the crowd, and the men opened for her, still laughing, and one of them swept his hat off in a bow so deep it was an accusation. She did not look at him. At the trader's table she drew off her right glove, and out of it she counted onto the wood a silver half-dime and 2 copper cents, laid flat and separate, the way a woman lays out buttons. Kettleman's clerk filled out the bill of sale. Received of Orpha Renfrew, widow of Adams County, the sum of 7 cents being full consideration for one Negro man called Goliath, aged about 22 years, which said, "Negro, I warrant to be a slave for life, but do not warrant sound." Kettleman signed it. She folded it into her glove, and as she did it, the men close enough to see swore afterward that there was already a paper in that glove, a small one folded to a square, soft at the creases the way paper gets when it has been handled a great many times. She walked back to the block, and she stood in front of the giant, and she had to tip her head back a long way to look at him. "My name is Mrs. Renfrew," she said. "I have a place 11 miles east. There is no cotton on it worth speaking of, and there is not enough to eat, but nobody there will strike you." He did not move. He did not look at her. He looked out over her head at the road, at the dust, at the buzzards, with those crooked jaws set, the way a man looks at weather he has decided to stop minding. "Can you walk 11 miles?" she asked. He stepped down off the block. The boards groaned again, and he stood waiting by her mule cart, like a house someone had moved. The road east out of Natchez ran through the Low S Hills, and in July it was a trench of white dust, 12 feet deep in places, cut down through the soft earth by 60 years of wheels, with the roots of the beeches hanging out of the banks overhead like the underside of something turned over. The mule went at a walk. Mrs. Renfrew drove. The giant would not sit in the cart. He walked behind it, and after 4 miles she stopped arguing about it. At the top of the second hill a rain came in off the river, warm as bath water, and it laid the dust and turned the cut into a red creek, and they went on through it. She watched him in the corner of her eye. He walked with a short, careful hitch on the left side, an old thing, a hip that had been out and put back badly. He never once looked at the woods. That was the thing she noticed and could not stop noticing. Every man she had ever known who had been sold and moved looked at the woods. They looked at them the way a hungry man looks at a bakery window, sidelong, quick, ashamed. This one did not. He looked at the road and at the back of the cart and nowhere else, and she understood that somewhere in the last 11 years the woods had been taken out of him. Tallow Creek sat at the end of a lane of dying cedars, a house of 6 rooms unpainted, its gallery sagging on the west end where the sill had rotted, a kitchen out back, a gin house with half its roof gone, a barn, and a row of 8 cabins, of which one had stood empty for 11 years, 420 acres, 18 people, 2 mules where there had been 9. They came out to look at him. They always came out to look, and the looking was never idle, because a new man on a place was a new fact about everybody's life. Ansel, who was 60 and had driven for the Renfrews since before Orpha married into the name, came out from the barn wiping his hands and stopped dead. Cressy, 22, came around the corner of the kitchen with a basket of shelled corn on her hip and did not put it down for a full minute. Little Sari hid behind her mother. Toby, who had come to Tallow Creek only that spring and had still not been told why, stood in the door of his cabin and watched with the flat, blank face of a man who had learned to have no opinions. And in the kitchen door stood Zilpa. She was 58 and looked older, and she cooked for the house and had cooked for the house since she was a girl. Her hands were burned white across the backs from 40 years of iron. She stood in the doorway with a dish towel, and she looked up at the enormous man standing in her yard in the rain, and Orpha Renfrew found that she had stopped breathing. Zilpa's face did not change. She looked at him for perhaps 3 seconds, no longer than she'd look at a peddler, and then she turned around and went back to her stove, and the sound of the skillet came out into the yard, and that was all. Orpha let out her breath so hard it hurt. "Ansel," she said, "the end cabin." Ansel's head came up. "Ma'am? The end cabin. That's—" He stopped himself. 60 years had taught him where the wall was. "Yes'm." Cressy set the basket down. It was a small thing, and the whole place felt it. The cabin at the end of the row had been shut since the fall of 1838. Nobody had been put in it. Nobody had asked to be put in it. The roof was sound and the chimney drew, and there was no reason on God's earth for it to sit empty on a place where 4 grown people slept in one room, and yet it had sat empty because Zilpa had lived in it with her boy. And when the boy died, she had moved up to the loft over the kitchen and had never once walked past the end of the row again. She went the long way around, through the garden, even in the rain. 11 years. That evening the neighbour came. Chalmers Fenwick of Ivywild owned 900 acres and 41 people, and a new brick house with a fanlight over the door, and he rode over on a bay gelding because he had heard by 3 o'clock, the way everyone had heard by 3 o'clock. He did not dismount. He sat looking at the giant, who was splitting stovewood by the kitchen with a maul that had been the heaviest tool on the place, and now looked like a toy. "Orpha," Fenwick said, "you have bought Kettleman's killer. I have bought a man for 7 cents. You have bought a thing that cannot be sold. That is a different transaction." He shifted in the saddle. "Do you know why Ruel could not move him? He has been on that block 4 times in 3 years. 4. He was carried down to New Orleans in March and carried back. There is not a trader on the river who will lay out money on a man that won't speak, because a man that won't speak is a man that has decided something, and you cannot buy out a decision." "Then I have got the best of him," she said, "because I paid 7 cents. You have got a mouth to feed the size of 2 mouths and a mortgage on this place, at the Britton House in Natchez, that I happen to know the figure of." He let that sit. "Folks are saying things, Orpha. Folks always did. They're saying Barnabas is 6 months in the ground and his widow has sold the good mules and bought 2 grown Negroes at above market and now a cripple for pennies and cannot say what for." He leaned down. "I am asking you as a friend of your husband's. What are you doing?" She looked up at him from the bottom of the steps, a small dry woman in a rusty black dress, and Fenwick would testify later, under oath, that her face at that moment was the calmest face he ever saw on a living person. "I am paying a debt," she said. "Good evening, Chalmers." That night, late, Zilpa came up onto the gallery, which she did not do. She stood at the rail with her back to the house and said, "Why that cabin? It was empty. It'd been empty 11 years. It has a good roof." They all got good roofs. Zilpa turned around. In the dark, her face was only a shape. "Ms. Renfrew, I've cooked in this house since I was 9 years old. I know when you lying. You got a way of getting real polite." Orpha Renfrew sat in her dead husband's chair, with her hands flat on her knees, and told the woman the first lie she had told her in 40 years that she knew at the moment of telling it she would have to answer for. "He is a large man," she said. "He needs the room." It had begun in February in the room Barnabas had called his office, 5 weeks after they buried him. He had died of an apoplexy in the gin house in the middle of a sentence, on a cold morning in the 2nd week of January, and he had died the way he lived, in the exact center of his own arrangements, and Orpha had discovered within a week that the arrangements were rot all the way down. The cotton had failed twice. There were notes at 2 houses in Natchez. There was a judgment out of Wilkinson County she had never heard of. She sat in that office 6 hours a day for a month with the books, and she was good at books. She had kept her father's store ledgers in Kentucky as a girl, which was the only thing about her Barnabas had ever praised out loud, and by the end of the month she understood the plantation better than her husband had. Which is how she came to notice the chimney. The office fireplace had a brick out of true on the left side of the throat, and she noticed it because she was cold and poking at the fire and thinking about money. She worked the brick loose with a letter opener. Behind it was a cavity a foot deep, and in the cavity was a pine box the size of a Bible box, and in the box was a book. It was a ledger of the ordinary kind, marbled boards, ruled in blue. It began in 1826 and ended in the spring of 1848, and it had nothing in it about cotton. The columns were headed in Barnabas Renfrew's small upright clerk's hand. No. Sex, age, of, date, rect, to, act, given. There were 31 lines. She read the first one 4 times before it came apart into words. No. 1. Girl, infant, of Zilpah. 9. May 1826, $75. Bledsoe, Woodville. Act given, born dead. Her hands were entirely steady. She noticed that and found it obscene. She turned the page. No. 2. Boy, 6 years of charity, 14 Jan 1828. 180s Kettleman, runoff. Number 3, girl, 19 winners of charity, 14 Jan 1828, 210 Kettleman, runoff. Number 4, boy, 4 years of Hagar, 2 Deck 1829, $150 Bledsoe, drowned in creek. She read all 31. It took her a long time because of the last column. Act given, the account given, not to God and not to a court. Because neither God nor a court in the state of Mississippi had ever asked Barnabas Renfrew a single question about the disposal of his own property. The account given was to the mothers. He had sold a child, and then he had gone out to the quarter and given an account, and then he had come back into this room and written down what he had said so as not to contradict himself later. He had kept a record of his own lies for 22 years, in a neat hand with the dates, so that he would not slip, and she had been in the house for all of it. She had nursed Hagar's fever the winter the creek took the boy who did not drown. She had given Charity a length of calico the spring the 2 children ran off, and she remembered, thinking privately, that it was a hard thing but that they had been ungrateful children. And halfway down the second page, no. 14 Mauboy, 11 wearer, of Zilpah, Fortunov, 1838, 410, Kettleman, Agwe, buried low field, and in the margin, in the same small upright hand, the way a careful man notes which of his people he sent on an errand, D.Y. attending. She had stood at that grave. She could bring the whole afternoon up entire the way you can with things you did not know were important. A cold, clear November, the smell of the pine box, Barnabas saying the Lord's Prayer too fast, and Zilpah on her knees in the sedge with her hands full of dirt, and Orpha Renfrew's own gloved hand on Zilpah's shoulder, and Orpha Renfrew's own voice saying, "He is at rest. He is out of it now. He is better off." She had said that. She had believed she was being kind. She had gone back to the house afterward and written in her diary that it had been a sad day and that Zilpah had borne it well. She sat in the office until the fire went out and the room went blue with mourning. What she felt was not grief, and she was clear-eyed enough to know it. Grief is for something taken from you. What she felt was the floor of her whole life going out from under her at once, because it was not only Barnabas. Barnabas had sold them, but Barnabas had needed a house that would not ask. He had needed a wife who would take Agay for an answer and write in her diary that the cook had borne it well. He had needed a woman who was not curious, and she had been that woman for 31 years, and she had been comfortable, and the comfort had been paid for in the last column of that book. She did not tell anyone. She did not go out to the kitchen and put the ledger in Zilpah's hands. And afterward she would think about why for the rest of her life, and the honest answer was cowardice, because there is no way to hand a woman that book. There is no sentence that goes in front of it. Instead, she did what she knew how to do. She did arithmetic. She sold the 4 good mules in March and got $340. She sold her mother's silver and Barnabas's watch and the Woodville lot and got $700 more. In April, she went to the Britton House in Natchez and borrowed $1,500 more against 420 acres of tired cotton land that already carried $7,900 of her husband's debt, and the factor looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment and said, "Ma'am, this is the whole of it," and she said, "Yes." $2,540. 700 of it went straight to the Wilkinson County Judgment to keep the sheriff off the lane. 529 went for corn and bacon and salt, and the doctor because a plantation that makes no crop still eats. And then she began going to the sales. She bought Tobe out of a Concordia Parish estate sale in May for $780, bidding against a trader until the trader quit, and looked at her with real curiosity, because Tobe was number 9, a boy of 7 sold in 1834 to a buyer named Prewitt, account given, sent to his people in Virginia, which was a lie so bald that Barnabas had underlined it. Tobe was 22 now. He remembered nothing of Tallow Creek and did not believe her when she said he had been born there, and she did not press it, and he had been on the place 2 months and had spoken perhaps 40 words. She bought Winner in June for $520 at the forks of the road, because Winner was number 22. Winner was 31 and had a hand that had been broken and never set, and a way of standing very still when a white person came into a room. 2 out of 31, and the money gone. And then in July, Ruel Kettleman put a man on the block that no one would buy, and Orpha Renfrew stood under the pecan tree with a folded paper in her glove, and on that paper was one line copied out in her own hand. No. 14 boy and 11 Haureskrist of Zilpa. Fashionov 1838, 410 Kettleman, 7 cents. She had $11 left in the world. He would not sleep in the cabin. He slept the first week on the ground outside its door with his back against the wall, and when the rain came he slept under the gin house, and Ansel said to leave him be, and she left him be. The work he did was frightening. He cleared the canebrake on the North Line in 9 days, alone, work that would have taken 4 men a month. He put the sill back under the west end of the gallery by lifting the corner of the house with his shoulder, while Ansel drove the block in, and Ansel sat down afterward and had to be helped up. He never rested, and he never hurried, and he never once looked at anybody straight on. The others were afraid of him at first, and then they were not afraid so much as careful, the way you are careful around a hurt animal you have been feeding. Little Sari, who was 6 and had not yet learned what everybody else knew about the world, took to following him at a distance of about 20 feet and narrating her day at him. He never answered. He also never once moved away from her. Cressy was the one who tried. She was 22 and quick, and had no fear in her at all, which frightened Zilpa more than anything on that place. She would carry his food down to the row herself, and set it beside him, and sit on her heels and talk. "You got a name," she said, the 4th night. "I don't mean Goliath. That's a white man's joke. Everybody got a name their mama gave them." "Nothing. My mama named me Lucretia, and everybody call me Cressy, which I hate." She waited. "You want me to guess? I'm gon' guess one a night till I hit it." "Peter." "Nothing. Reuben, Aaron, Hardy, Titus." She grinned. "I got 200 names. You gon' be tired of me before I'm tired of you." 8 nights she did that, and on the 8th night she said, "Isaac," and something happened in the giant's face. Not a change exactly, a sort of settling the way water settles, and Cressy stopped grinning because she understood that she had not gotten close. She had gotten near, and that near was worse. And on the 9th night, Zilpa brought his supper down herself. She had not been to the end of the row in 11 years. She came down the row with a tin plate, and she did not look at the cabin door, and she set the plate on the block beside him and stood there with her arms crossed. "Cressy says you don't eat the greens," she said. "You eat the greens. You that size, you need the iron." "Nothing. I know what you doin'," Zilpa said. "You think you the first man come in here shut up? I seen 4. 2 of 'em opened up in a year, and 2 of 'em died shut. It ain't strength. Whatever it is, it ain't that." She waited. "You hear me?" He looked at the plate. She had cooked greens in the pot liquor with a piece of fat, and beside them she had put an ash cake, a plain thing, cornmeal and water and a pinch of salt, laid straight on the hearth in the ashes, and turned once, which was slave food and old food, and nobody in the big house had eaten one in 30 years. And she had done to it the thing she always did, which was to score it 3 times across the top with her thumbnail before it went in the fire, because that was how her own mother had marked hers. He picked it up and turned it over and saw the 3 lines. And Orpha Renfrew, watching from the dark window of the dining room 70 feet away, saw the biggest man she had ever seen in her life put down an ash cake and put both hands flat on the block and lower his head and shake, great silent heaves that went through his shoulders and did not make one sound, not one, because whatever had been done to him had gone all the way down to the place where sound comes from. Zilpa did not touch him. She stood there a long time. Then she said quietly, "All right." And she went back up to the kitchen, and she was crying, and she did not know why. and she told herself it was because she was 58 and tired, and because the man was pitiful, and because sometimes a thing just comes over you. She did not know. That was the horror of it, and Orpha stood at the window and made herself look at it. Zilpa did not know. She had stood 4 feet from her son and had not known him, because the last time she had seen his face it had been 11 years old and unbroken, and because she had been told he was dead and had believed it, and had spent 11 years making it true inside herself, which is work, which is the hardest work a person ever does, and it had cost her everything, and she had finished it. And he would not tell her. That was the part Orpha could not make sense of for weeks, until the night in late August, when she came down for water and found him sitting on the kitchen steps in the dark, with his ruined hand open on his knee, and she sat down on the step above him, an old woman in a shawl, and she said the thing plainly. "I know who you are," she said. "You are Zilpa's boy. You were sold on the 4th of November, 1838, to Ruel Kettleman for $410 by my husband, and he told her you died of the ague, and I stood at the grave and I believed him. He did not move. I have had a paper in my glove with your line on it since February," she said. "Every sale I have gone to, I have gone with it. I did not know you when I saw you. I knew the size and the age and the letter Kettleman burns on them, and I have been wrong twice this spring." Her voice was as flat as a person reading off a list. "You have been in this yard 6 weeks, and you have not gone to her. Why?" The wind moved in the cedars. Down at the row a dog barked twice and quit, and the man reached over and took her hand. She was too startled to pull it back, and he turned it palm up, and with one finger, slowly, he wrote on her palm. It took a long time. He had never had a pen in his hand in his life. He had learned his letters in a holding pen at the forks of the road, from a man who scratched them in the dirt with a bent nail, which was against the law in Mississippi and cost them both a beating when it was found out. He made them the way a child makes them, huge and wrong way, and she had to say each one out loud as he made it to keep her place, and twice he had to start over. What he wrote was, "I held a man down." She sat very still. He was not finished. He turned her hand and wrote again, smaller, faster now, and she said the letters out loud into the dark, one at a time, and put them together, and what he had written was, "They made me, and I did it." I said his name. His name was Obed. She learned it in pieces over the rest of that summer on the kitchen steps at night, one word at a time on the palm of her hand, and she learned the rest of it from a free man of color named Isham Fay, who made barrels in Natchez and had a memory like a courthouse. Isham Fay was 39 and had been freed in 1831 by a special act of the Mississippi legislature, the only road there was, after he pulled 2 children out of a burning warehouse on Silver Street, and he carried his freedom papers in an oilcloth wallet against his chest and touched them roughly every quarter hour without knowing he did it. He made the barrels for half the plantations in Adams County, which meant he went everywhere, which meant he heard everything. And he was the most careful man Orpha Renfrew ever met, and he had reason to be. She went to him in August, because she needed someone who could read a deed book and could not afford to gossip. "Ma'am," he said when she had finished, "I want to be plain with you about what you are asking. You are asking a free black man to go into the Adams County Courthouse and read bills of sale for Negroes, and to go into Ruel Kettleman's counting room and read his books. If a white man takes it in his head to ask me why, I have got no answer that saves me. I have got a shop and 2 apprentices and a paper in my coat that any drunk on Silver Street can burn. I know it." "You do not know it," Isham Fay said, not unkindly. "You cannot. But I will do it." He set down his ads. "You want to know why before you ask me again, and I have to lie. My sister was sold out of Rodney in 1822, and I have never found her, and I have been reading deed books on my own account since the day I was freed. I am not doing you a service. You have got a list. I have never had a list." They worked from the end of August into October. She wrote out orders in her own hand. "Isham Fay is about my business, O Renfrew," and he carried them. And in the record room of the Adams County Courthouse, he sat at the end of the long table with the deed books and turned pages until his eyes ran. Not every sale of a human being was recorded. Most were not. But mortgages were recorded, and estate inventories were recorded, and sheriff sales were recorded. And a man who is patient can walk a number from a ledger to a name in a probate file to a name on a Concordia parish tax roll if he is willing to spend 40 nights doing it. Twice a deputy clerk stood over him and asked what business a cooper had with Book K, and both times Isham Faye produced the paper in the widow's hand and kept his eyes down and said nothing else, because a free man in Mississippi in 1849, who explained himself well, was more frightening to white men than one who did not explain himself at all. The second time, the clerk kept the paper for an hour before giving it back. Isham did not go into the courthouse again for 11 days, and when he did, he went at noon when the room was full and a man could be seen. And in October, he coopered 18 barrels for Kettleman's warehouse, and he was left alone in the counting room for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon, and he read the trader's daybook for 1838 straight through, and did not write down a single word, and carried it out in his head. They put the list together on the dining room table at Tallow Creek with the doors shut. 31 numbers, 31 children. 9 of them were dead and could be proved dead. 3 in 1 week in the Louisiana cholera of 1833. 1 on a Bayou Lafourche sugar estate at 14. The others in ways nobody had troubled to write down. 6 could not be traced at all. Sold to a trader who went broke. Sold to Texas. Sold, and then the record simply stops, which happens to people the way it happens to hogsheads of sugar. 11 were alive and locatable at a distance. Yazoo City, Concordia, a place on the Homachito. A woman of 29 in Vicksburg, who had 4 children of her own now, and did not know she had ever had a mother in Adams County. And 5, counting Obed and Tobe and Winner, were at Tallow Creek, or within a day's ride of it. "There is a thing in the book you have not asked me about," Isham Faye said at the end of that night, "and I have gone back and forth about telling you." "Tell me. The of column. Read it down." He waited while she did it. 9 of those 31 are of the same 4 women, and every one of the 9 went out of this place before it was 8 years old, and the price on them was high for the age. That is not a man selling off increase, Mrs. Renfrew. A man selling off increase sells the ones he does not want to look at. She was quiet a long time. "I know what you're telling me," she said finally. "I did not want to be the one." "You are not." She closed the book. He was, every day for 22 years at that table over the mutton. Word got out that autumn the way word does. Not the whole of it. Nobody knew about the ledger yet. But the widow Renfrew had been seen at 3 sales buying grown Negroes at above market, with money she did not have. And a free cooper had been seen in the record room with paper from her hand. And Ruel Kettleman, who had bought 11 of the 31 over 22 years, began to be a man who did not enjoy hearing her name. And Chalmers Fenwick of Ivywild, whose late father, Judge Fenwick, appeared twice in the 4th column, began to be a man who crossed the street. What happened at the forks of the road that July morning was not unusual, and that is the most important fact about it. Congress prohibited the importation of captives from Africa effective January 1st, 1808. What followed was not the end of the trade, but its turning inward. As tobacco land in the Upper South wore out and cotton spread west, historians estimate that roughly 1 million enslaved people were carried from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. Most moved through sale rather than with a migrating owner. An estimate suggests about 1 in 3 enslaved children in the exporting states was separated from at least one parent. Natchez sat at the receiving end. In 1833, following a cholera outbreak, the city barred slave trading within its limits, and the traders relocated to a crossroads a mile east, where the Liberty and Washington roads met. The forks of the road became one of the largest markets in the Deep South, second in the region only to New Orleans. The Alexandria firm of Franklin and Armfield shipped people there through the 1830s. Traders kept inventories listing height, age, complexion, skills, and what they termed faults. Those judged unsound were discounted heavily and sold in lots, and the trade's own paperwork called them refuse. Mississippi law placed no restriction on selling a child away from its mother at any age. Louisiana, by an act of 1829, prohibited the sale of children under 10 apart from their mothers. Mississippi never passed such a law, which is to say that everything written in Barnabas Renfrew's hidden ledger was perfectly legal, and this is precisely what made the next thing so dangerous, because it was not the law his widow was about to run into. It was her own family. Wilkins Renfrew arrived from Woodville on the 9th of November with a valise and a lawyer. He was Barnabas's brother's son, 34, handsome in a soft way, with beautiful manners and the eyes of a man counting the silver while he compliments the soup. He kissed his aunt's hand. He said the place was looking well, which was a lie so large it was almost friendly. He stayed 4 days, and on the 3rd day he asked very gently whether he might glance at the books as family, as a comfort to her. She let him. She had no grounds to refuse and no strength to invent one. He found the Britain note. He found the sale of the mules and the silver and the Woodville lot. He found $1,300 paid out inside of 2 months for 2 grown field hands worth at the outside $1,000 between them at a moment when his aunt could not pay her taxes. And he found a bill of sale for a crippled mute, purchased at 7 cents. He copied every figure into a memorandum book in a beautiful round hand, and he was in Natchez by the following Tuesday. On the 21st of November, the probate court of Adams County received a petition, sworn by Wilkins Renfrew, praying that an inquisition be held to determine whether Orpha Renfrew, widow, was of unsound mind and incapable of managing her estate, and that a guardian of her person and property be appointed. The southern courts had a name for that proceeding, and it was older than the state, de lunatico inquirendo. A jury of 12 men would be empaneled. They would hear evidence. If they found her non compos mentis, her property, the land, the debts, and the 19 human beings the law counted among her chattels, would pass under the control of a conservator, and every bill of sale she had signed since February could be attacked as the act of a woman not in her right mind. Dr. Mercer Pitt came out from Natchez on the 28th to examine her, because the petition required a physician's certificate. He was not a cruel man. He was worse than cruel. He was reasonable. He sat in her parlor with his hat on his knee and asked her whether she slept and whether she heard her husband's voice and whether she had been troubled by dreams, and she said no to all of it. Then he asked why she had bought the Negro at the forks of the road. Because he was for sale, she said. Mrs. Renfrew, a woman in your circumstances, does not buy what is for sale. She buys what she needs. That is exactly right, doctor. He wrote for a while. Then he said without looking up, you understand that if you were to tell me you had a reason, a plain, ordinary mistaken reason, sentiment, grief, anything a jury could put a name to, I could write it down and this would very likely go away. And she looked at that man for a long moment and understood that he was offering her the whole of her old life back at the price of 1 sentence, and that the sentence would have to be a small one, and that she had spent 31 years saying small sentences. I have nothing to tell you, she said, doctor. Pitt certified that in his opinion, the widow Renfrew exhibited a fixed and irrational purpose respecting the disposition of her estate, and the court set the matter for January, and in the meantime, it appointed a receiver to protect the estate from waste. And the receiver, on Wilkins Renfrew's recommendation, hired an overseer to manage the place until the matter was decided. The overseer's name was Doc Yarbrough. He rode into the yard at Tallow Creek on the 2nd of December on a rangy grey horse, a lean, sunburned man of about 60, with a soft voice and a habit of smiling with his mouth closed. He had been overseer at Tallow Creek from 1830 to 1841, and he had gone from there to Ivywild, and he had been out of a place since the spring. Orpha Renfrew stood on the gallery and watched him come and felt the last 11 months of her life close over her head like water. Because Doc Yarbrough had put the boy in the cart. She knew it from the ledger's own margins, where the same 3 initials stood 11 times over in Barnabas's hand, D.Y. attending. Yarbrough had driven the cart to the forks of the road on the 4th of November, 1838. Yarbrough had come back and told the quarter the boy had taken the egg on the road to Natchez and had died in a shed at Washington and been buried quick for fear of contagion. Yarbrough had nailed up the box. Yarbrough had carried one end of it into the low field. He dismounted. He took off his hat to her, which was worse than not. Ms. Renfrew, Mr. Yarbrough, I am sorry it's like this, he said. And the awful thing was that he half meant it. It ain't personal, ma'am, it's the court. Then he turned and looked down the row at the man splitting wood by the kitchen, and Orpha watched Doc Yarbrough's face over the space of about 4 seconds, and she saw him do the arithmetic and she saw the answer arrive. He knew him at once. Of course he did. Yarbrough had not spent 11 years making a boy dead inside himself. Yarbrough had spent 11 years not thinking about it at all, which leaves the memory in perfect condition. He put his hat back on. That's a big buck, he said pleasantly. That the 7-cent one? That is Obed. Is it? He smiled with his mouth closed. Well, he'll bring more than 7 cents at a sheriff's sale, I'd say. Estate's got debts. Within a week, he had written to the receiver recommending the sale of the Negro man called Goliath, of no value to this place, being unsound and dangerous, but of some value at Natchez. Within 2 weeks, he had moved into the overseer's house and put the place on a 6-day week and taken the corn allowance down. Within 3, he had begun coming up to the office in the evenings to go through the papers, because a receiver's man was entitled to the papers, and Orpha Renfrew sat in the parlor and listened to the drawers of her husband's desk open and shut, one after another, night after night. And she knew what he was hunting. On the night of the 19th of December, she came out of the house at 11 o'clock because she smelled smoke, and she saw Doc Yarbrough in the yard by the ash pit, feeding a marbled ledger into a fire, page by page, patiently, the way a careful man burns a thing. And from the black shadow of the kitchen wall, 6 feet away from Orpha and unseen, Cressy watched too, with her hand over her own mouth, and did not make one sound. She did not sleep. By morning she had decided, and by noon she had sent Anseal for Squire Ollivant, and Ollivant came out from the Crossroads store with his son and 6 neighbors he had collected on the road, because a widow sending for a magistrate in a rainstorm is the best news a county gets in December. By 3 o'clock, there were 9 white men and every soul on the place standing in the low field in a cold rain. She had no authority to do it. That is the truth, and she knew it standing there. A woman under a lunacy petition with a receiver's man on the place has no authority to do anything. What she had was a thing Doc Yarbrough wanted more than he wanted his dignity, and she used it. "Mr. Yarbrough," she said, "you burned a book last night." The rain came down. Yarbrough's face did not move. "I know what was in it," she said, "because I have copied it out entire in my own hand twice, and 1 copy is not on this place." That was a lie. She would think about that lie later, too. "Your name is in it, not as a buyer. You had no money. You are in it as the man who drove the cart. 11 times, Mr. Yarbrough, 11 times over 11 years, and each time you came back and stood in that quarter and gave an account." Squire Ollivant said, "Mrs. Renfrew, what in God's name—" "Get a shovel, Mr. Yarbrough," she said, "and open that grave." There was a long moment when the whole thing hung. Yarbrough could have ridden off. He could have laughed. What he did instead, and she understood afterward that this was the only truly incomprehensible thing that happened that whole year, was take the shovel out of Anseal's hands and walk to the low field and start digging in front of everybody in the rain without a word. Perhaps because there were 9 white witnesses and a refusal is an admission, perhaps because he had been carrying it. She never knew. It was not deep. Nothing about it had ever been meant to be permanent. The box came up in pieces, black and soft, and the men lifted the lid off with the shovel blade, and inside there was a rotted quilt, and inside the quilt there were stones from the creek, 20 or 30 of them, water-smoothed the size of a child's head and a child's fists, laid out long, the way you would lay a boy. Zilpah did not scream. Orpha had braced herself for a scream, had lain awake constructing it, and there was none. What Zilpah did was go down on her knees in the mud beside the box and pick up one of the stones and hold it against her chest with both hands and rock, and the sound that came out of her was low and even and went on, a sound with no shape to it, and every person in that field who had ever lost anybody knew what it was. And 2 of the white men turned their backs. Ollivant said, "Whose grave is this?" "It is Zilpah's boy's grave," Orpha said. "There has never been anybody in it. My husband sold him to Ruel Kettleman on the 4th of November, 1838, for $410, and Mr. Yarbrough drove the cart, and Mr. Yarbrough told this woman her child died on the road. And Zilpa's rocking stopped. She got up out of the mud, slowly, an old woman with a stone in her hands, and she turned around, and she did not look at Yarbrough at all. That was the thing that struck everybody who was there. She turned all the way around past him, past Olivant, past all of them, to the edge of the field, where the biggest man any of them had ever seen was standing at the fence rail with his hat off. He had taken his hat off. That was how she found him. In 5 months, nobody had once seen him bareheaded out of doors, and he had taken his hat off and stood in the rain to be looked at. Zilpa walked across that field. It took a long time. When she got to him, she did not look at his face. She reached up and took his left forearm and turned it over, and on the inside of it, from the wrist halfway to the elbow, there was an old scald scar, shiny and white and shaped like a spread hand, from a pot of grease pulled off a hearth by a 4-year-old in the summer of 1831, when his mother had turned her back for the length of one breath. She put her thumb on it. Then she looked up at him, and Obed shook his head, once, hard. He backed a step into the fence. He put his own hand flat on his chest and pushed, twice. Not him. Gone. Not him. And his crooked face came apart in a way that was terrible to watch, and he made a sound at last, the first sound anybody at Tallow Creek had heard out of him, and it was not a word. It was the noise of a man trying to keep something shut that has decided to open. Zilpa took hold of his shirt in both fists. "No," she said. "No, sir. Don't you do that." Her voice was shaking, and it did not stop her. "I know what you telling me. You telling me the boy died anyhow. You telling me they made you into something out there and what come back ain't him. And I ought to keep my grief where I had it, 'cause it was clean." She shook him, or tried. It was like shaking a post. "Boy, look at me. I buried a box of rocks for 11 years. 11 years I got up and made this family's breakfast with a box of rocks in the ground. Don't you dare hand me another one." He went down on his knees in the mud. He was still nearly as tall as she was. She put both arms around his head and held it against her, and she said his name, and then she said it again, and she went on saying it. And behind them, in the low field, Doc Yarbrough stood holding the shovel with the rain running off his hat brim, and Squire Olivant said, "Well, Doc?" And Yarbrough said the sentence that finished him in Adams County, though it took a year to work. It was a business matter, he said. He got on his grey horse and rode out of the lane, and did not come back, and the receiver replaced him in January, and by the following autumn he had gone to Louisiana. Not for what he had done, which half the men in that field had ordered done on their own places, but because he had said it out loud in front of witnesses, and there was not a table in 3 counties that wanted him at it afterward. The Inquisition was held in the Adams County Courthouse on the 14th of January, 1850. It took 1 day. There were 12 men in the box, and perhaps 60 in the room, because the story had been going around Natchez since July, and everyone wanted the end of it. Wilkins Renfrew's lawyer was thorough and gentle, and did not raise his voice once, which made it worse. He laid it out in order. A woman of 51 widowed a 12-month. Within 60 days of the funeral, she sells the working stock of a cotton plantation. She sells her mother's plate, her husband's watch, and a town lot. She borrows $1,500 against 420 acres that already carry 7,900 of her husband's debt. And then she goes to market. Not to buy mules, gentlemen, not to buy seed, and pays $780 and $520 for 2 grown field hands worth 1,000 between them at the outside, at a moment when she cannot pay her taxes. And then, in July, before 40 witnesses, she pays 7 cents for a crippled mute that the trade itself had given up on. And in December, she assembles the neighborhood in a rainstorm and digs up a child's grave. "We do not say she is wicked," the lawyer said. "We say she is not well. Grief takes people in strange ways, and there is no shame in it. We ask only that her property be kept safe until she is herself." Ruel Kettleman testified for an hour and enjoyed every minute of it. Chalmers Fenwick testified that he had asked her directly in July what she was doing, and that she had answered, "I am paying a debt," and could not say to whom or how much. Isham Fay sat at the back of that room for the whole day. and was not called and could not have been. Mississippi law did not permit any black person, free or enslaved, to give evidence against a white person in any court in the state. Every fact in the case that mattered had passed through his hands, and the law's position was that he did not exist. So it fell to Absalom Tate, who was 71 and had been Orpha Renfrew's father's lawyer in Kentucky 40 years before, and had come down the river at his own expense, and who stood up now and asked leave to put a document in evidence. Cressy had it. She had taken it out of the desk on the 18th of December, the night before the fire, and put it under a floorboard in her mother's cabin, and what Doc Yarborough had burned in the yard so patiently, page by page, was Barnabas Renfrew's 1846 cotton book. On Christmas morning, Cressy had carried the real one up to the house wrapped in a meal sack and set it on the table and said only, "I figured he'd get to it." Isham Fay had taken it into Natchez inside a barrel of white oak staves. Tate read it aloud. All 31 lines. It took 11 minutes. And here is the thing that Orpha Renfrew carried for the rest of her life, and that she said afterward was the only moment of the whole business when she was afraid she might actually lose her reason. The room was not horrified. There was a stir at first, the novelty of it, the hidden book, the brick in the chimney. But as Tate read on, the room settled, and she watched 60 faces settle, and she understood what she was looking at. Not one line in that ledger was a crime. Selling a child of 4 away from its mother was not a crime in Mississippi. Telling the mother it had drowned was not a crime. Burying an empty box in a field and standing over it with your hat off was not a crime. It was, at worst, a private ugliness of the sort a gentleman does not discuss, and there was not a man in that room who did not know 3 others like it. What moved them was the 4th column, the buyers, because Judge Fenwick's name was in it twice, and Kettleman's 11 times, and a name belonging to a family that had a pew at Trinity, and when Tate read those out, the room went cold and tight in a way it had not gone cold for the children, and Orpha Renfrew sat with her gloved hands in her lap and understood exactly what she was living in. Tate asked her 3 questions. "Mrs. Renfrew, did you know of this book while your husband lived?" "I did not." "When did you first read it?" "The 18th of February at about 9 in the evening." "Mrs. Renfrew, the petition says you are of unsound mind. What have you to say?" And she stood up and said, in a voice that did not carry past the 3rd row, "I am not mad. I am late." Then Tate did the thing that actually won it, because it was never going to be won on conscience. He put the Britton House factor on the stand and established, item by item, that Tallow Creek stood mortgaged and encumbered at $9 $400 against an assessed value of $8 $100, that the taxes were 2 years in arrears, and that the estate of Barnabas Renfrew had been insolvent on the day the man died. There was nothing to conserve. Whatever Wilkins Renfrew had ridden down from Woodville to protect, his aunt had already spent, and every dollar of it had gone into human beings she could not sell without unspending it. He withdrew the petition before the jury retired. He had been advised that a conservator of an insolvent estate collects nothing and pays the lawyers. She was found of sound mind at 20 minutes past 4, and she walked out of that courthouse into the cold and stood on the steps a moment, and not one person spoke to her. And she was 51 years old and had no land, no husband, no money, no friends, and 19 human beings on a piece of dirt that would be sold out from under them at the courthouse door before the spring was out. Isham Fay was waiting at the bottom of the steps with the mule cart. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "Now the hard part." The hard part was this, and Absalom Tate explained it to her that night in his rented room on Main Street, with a fire going and his spectacles pushed up on his forehead. She could not free them, not by will, not by deed, not by kindness, not by wanting to. Mississippi's Code of 1822 had made manumission possible only by a special act of the legislature, granted for extraordinary service to the state, and granted almost never, and requiring in any case that the freed person leave Mississippi. And in 1842, the legislature had gone further and prohibited emancipation by last will and testament altogether, so that a man could not even do at his death what he had lacked the courage for in life. "There is no door in this state," Tate said. "There has not been for 8 years. Isaac Ross tried it in Jefferson County, died in 36, willed his people free and passage to Liberia, and his own kin fought the will for years. The High Court upheld it in 1840, and even then it was near a decade before those people sailed. And that was a rich man with a famous name and a courtroom full of lawyers. He took his spectacles down. "You have got $11. Then what is left?" "Distance," said Absalom Tate. "It is the only thing that has ever worked. You cannot make them free here. You can carry them somewhere they already are." So she sold Tallow Creek. Chalmers Fenwick bought it at the courthouse door on the 11th of February for $9,800. He had wanted that 420 acres for 19 years because it lay against his own north line, and he paid more for it than any assessor in Adams County thought it was worth. And Absalom Tate observed dryly that if the man had made that offer in December, there would have been a solvent estate to conserve, and she would have lost every soul on the place. Fenwick did not come to the sale himself. He sent his factor. She never spoke to him again. The mortgage was cleared and the taxes and the costs, and when everything was paid, Orpha Renfrew had $214 and a trunk. And on the 22nd of February 1850, she walked down the levee at Natchez under the hill and bought deck passage on the steamer Ariadne for herself and 19 people. And the clerk looked at the manifest and then up at her and said, "Ma'am, you'll want papers for these." She had papers. Isham Fay had spent 3 weeks on them, a bill of sale for every soul in her name, notarized, and a written pass in her hand for each, and a letter from Absalom Tate on his own paper, stating that Mrs. Orpha Renfrew was removing her property to the state of Ohio for her own purposes. It was all perfectly legal and perfectly ordinary. Planters moved property upriver all the time. Nobody ever asked why a woman was taking 19 field hands to Cincinnati in February, because the only reason anybody could imagine was a bad one, and bad reasons did not require explanation. They were stopped twice. At Vicksburg, a man in a good coat came down the deck counting heads and wanted to see the papers, and looked a long time at Obed and said, "You are carrying a fortune in one man there, ma'am." And she said, "I am carrying a debt." And he laughed and went away. At Memphis, 2 slave catchers came aboard at midnight looking for a woman and a boy off a place in Tunica County, and they went through the deck passengers with a lantern, holding it up to faces, and when the lantern came up to Zilpah's face, Zilpah looked straight into it and did not blink, and when it came up to Cressy's, Obed stood up. He simply stood up in the dark on a crowded deck, and the man with the lantern took 2 steps back before he knew he had done it and said, all right," and went on. They passed the mouth of the Ohio at Cairo on the 8th day and turned east and upstream, and for 2 more days the river ran with Kentucky on the right hand and Illinois on the left, and nobody on that deck slept much, and Ansil, who was 61 and had never in his life been north of Vicksburg, sat all night with his blanket around him, watching the left-hand bank go by. They landed at the Cincinnati Public Landing on the 4th of March, 1850 in snow. The Hamilton County Recorder's office was on Court Street, and the clerk was a young man with ink on his cuff and a cold, and he had done perhaps 40 of these in his career and was not surprised by any of it, which was, Orpha thought, the most extraordinary part. Ohio was free soil. It had been since it was a state. Only the year before, in February of 1849, the legislature had repealed the worst of the old black laws, the ones that had required black settlers to post a $500 bond and produce a court certificate of freedom before they could live and work there. A deed of manumission executed and recorded in that office was a fact the state of Ohio would honor, and the state of Mississippi could not reach. They did it one at a time. It took most of 2 days. The clerk wrote out the form and read it aloud and asked each person their name, and each person said it, and Orpha Renfrew signed at the bottom 19 times, until her hand cramped and she had to change the pen. Some of them had never in their lives been asked their name by a white man holding a pen. Ansil gave his as Ansil Marsh, after his father, who had been sold off in 1804, and whose surname he had carried in his head for 46 years without once having a use for it. Cressy gave hers as Lucretia Fay, and said it clearly, and looked sideways at Isham Fay, who had put down his ads in Natchez and sold his shop and come north with them, and had spent 10 days on that deck pretending he had not been looking at her, and who now went the color of brick in front of a room full of people. Winner took Winner Freeman and said it defiantly, as though somebody might argue. Zilpa stood a long time before she answered. "Zilpa Ransom," she said at last. The clerk wrote it. Then he said, without looking up, "Any children to be entered, ma'am?" And Zilpa said, "One, a girl, born the 9th of May 1826, and sold out of my arms the same day, and I never was told her name nor where she went, and I do not know if she is living." She said it steadily. "You can write that down or you can leave it out, but you asked me." The clerk stopped writing. He was 26 years old. After a moment he said, "I'll write it down," and he did, and that entry is the reason anybody knows about her at all. And then it was the last one. Obed came up to the desk, and the room got quiet, because he took up the whole of the space in front of it, and because everyone in that office had spent 2 days waiting for this without admitting it. The clerk dipped his pen. "Name? Nothing. Sir, I have to have the name. It's got to be spoke and entered." "That's the form of it." Nothing. The snow ticked on the window. Zilpa stood by the door with her hands folded, and did not come forward and did not help him, which was the greatest act of love anybody committed in that room, because she understood better than anyone alive what it was going to cost him, and that no one could carry any part of it. He had not spoken since the autumn of 1846, when a man named Pleasant ran off from Kettleman's Pens. Pleasant, who had scratched the alphabet in the dirt with a bent nail for a boy too big for his own age, and Obed, with his jaw already broken and his hip already out, had been beaten for 3 days, and on the 3rd day had said the name of the place, and they had brought Pleasant back and made Obed hold him, because that was what Obed was for, that was what the size of him was for. Afterward, he had made a decision in a shed at the forks of the road, and he had kept it for 3 years and more, against everything the world could bring against a man. He opened his mouth. The first sound was terrible. The jaw had healed wrong, and the tongue had gone lazy from disuse, and what came out was a wrecked, thick, dragging noise, and a woman waiting on the bench by the wall flinched, and he stopped, and his hands closed. Then he did it again. Obed. It was slurred and it was ugly, and it filled the room. "Obed," he said again, better, and then, with his eyes on his mother by the door, all of it. "Obed Ransom." The clerk wrote it out. Then he turned the book around and said, because it was the form and he said it 40 times a year, "And the consideration, ma'am, what was paid?" Orpha Renfrew looked at the line. Then she took off her right glove, and out of it she counted onto the desk a silver half-dime and 2 copper cents, laid flat and separate, the way a woman lays out buttons. 7 cents, she said, and she smiled. It was not a large smile, and it did not last, but it was the first one anybody had seen on that woman's face in 14 months, and the clerk did not understand it, and the people waiting on the bench did not understand it, and when the story got back down the river to Natchez, as it did by June, carried by a boat clerk and improved at every landing, nobody in Adams County understood it either. They told it for years, in the Natchez way, over cards. The mad Renfrew widow, sold out, ruined, run off north with every Negro she had left. And they say she stood in a courthouse in Ohio and gave away $12,000 worth of property and laughed about it. Grief, they said. Never was right after Barnabas died. Bought a cripple for 7 cents at the forks of the road, you recall that? 7 cents. Craziest thing anybody ever saw. They had the whole story, and they never had one word of it. The law Orpha Renfrew ran into was not an accident, and the road she took was the only one that existed. Mississippi's Slave Code of 1822 permitted manumission only by special act of the legislature, granted for what the statute called meritorious service, and required the freed person to leave the state. Such acts were rare, a few dozen across decades, in a state that by 1850 held more than 300,000 enslaved people. In 1842, the legislature closed the remaining route, prohibiting emancipation by last will and testament. The best-known test came from Jefferson County, where the planter Isaac Ross died in 1836, leaving a will directing that the people he held be freed and sent to Liberia. His heirs contested it for years. The High Court of Errors and Appeals upheld the will in 1840. Roughly 200 people finally sailed near the end of that decade. The alternative was distance. Owners who wished to free people generally had to carry them to free soil and record the deed there. Ohio entered the Union free in 1803, though its black laws of 1804 and 1807 required black residents to post a $500 bond and register certificates of freedom. In February 1849, the Ohio legislature repealed those provisions. Black Ohioans still could not vote or sit on juries, but a manumission recorded there was legally solid. That door did not stay open long. In September of 1850, Congress passed a new Fugitive Slave Act, and free black communities across the Ohio Valley began emptying toward Canada. Orpha Renfrew's party had crossed 6 months before. She never went south again. She took 2 rooms on 6th Street and kept herself by taking in sewing and by writing letters for people who could not, and she died in the spring of 1858 with $41 and a trunk and a copied list of 31 lines, of which 14 carried a mark in red ink. 3 she had carried north herself, and 11 more traced over 8 years by other people's money, Andy Champfay's patience, and a great many letters into the dark. Not all of the 11 were living, and not one of them was free. But they had names again, and somebody knew where they were. Number 1 was never found. Zilpah Ransom lived with her son on Broadway near the river, where he was hired on the levee because he could carry what 4 men carried, and where he was paid wages in coin into his own hand on Saturdays. He never spoke easily. It hurt him to do it, and it always sounded wrong, and among strangers he mostly did not bother. But he spoke, and around his neck on a leather cord until the day he died, he wore a small deerskin pouch, and inside it were a silver half-dime and 2 copper cents, which he had asked her for on the courthouse steps in the snow, in his ruined voice, in the first full sentence he had spoken in more than 3 years. "I want to keep what I cost," he said. She gave them to him, that is why she smiled.